Arrogant landlord evicts an elderly widow without mercy, but when he returns to inspect the house, he discovers something buried in the backyard that left him speechless. Mr. Benson stood on the front steps of the small, weathered cottage, his sharp knock echoing through the quiet neighborhood. His face was set in a hard, unyielding expression, one that had served him well in countless business deals over the years. He was a man used to getting what he wanted, and today was no different. The door creaked open, revealing Mrs. O'Leary, a frail elderly widow who had lived in the house for decades. Her wrinkled hands trembled as she clutched the door frame, eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. "Please, Mr. Benson," she began, her voice weak but determined. "I just need a little more time." Benson cut her off with a brisk wave of his hand, his tone cold and final. "You're 3 months behind on rent, Mrs. O'Leary. I've given you enough time. Today's the day you need to vacate." Mrs. O'Leary's lip quivered, and she reached into the pocket of her worn cardigan, pulling out a small, faded photograph. She held it up as though it might sway him, her voice breaking as she spoke. "My husband, God rest his soul, worked so hard to give us this home. It's all I have left of him, Mr. Benson. Can't you understand?" Benson glanced briefly at the photo. A young man in a military uniform, standing tall with a proud smile. The image stirred nothing in him. He had no time for sentimentality, no patience for the past. His eyes flicked back to Mrs. O'Leary, unmoved. "I understand that business is business, and I can't afford to let anyone stay for free." Tears welled in the widow's eyes as she looked around at the home she had cherished for so many years. The walls, now cracked and peeling, had once been filled with laughter, love, and memories. Her hands tightened around the photograph, as if holding on to it could somehow keep her life from crumbling any further. But no matter how much she pleaded, Benson's expression remained hard, his heart untouched. "I can give you until tomorrow to gather your things," he said, his voice clipped. "But after that, you're out." Mrs. O'Leary stifled a sob, nodding weakly. She knew there was no point in arguing with him. The landlord had made up his mind, and there was no kindness left in him to appeal to. Slowly, she retreated back into the house, leaving the door ajar as she shuffled down the narrow hallway, past the living room where she had spent countless evenings with her late husband. The house, once warm and alive, now felt like a tomb. Benson waited outside, glancing at his watch impatiently. As the minutes ticked by, his mind wandered to the profit he could make by selling the property. It was a prime location, and with a few renovations, he could easily flip it for a significant amount. To him, it was just another asset in his portfolio, another number in his bank account. The fact that it had been someone's home for over 40 years meant nothing. Business was business. After what felt like an eternity, Mrs. O'Leary emerged from the house, clutching a small bundle of belongings, a worn suitcase, a few framed photographs, and a crocheted blanket that looked as old as she was. She paused at the threshold, her gaze lingering on the house one last time. To her, it wasn't just a building. It was where her life had happened, where she had shared both joy and sorrow with the man she had loved. Leaving it felt like losing him all over again. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though it wasn't clear if she was apologizing to herself, to her late husband, or to the house. Benson cleared his throat, signaling it was time to go. Mrs. O'Leary lowered her head and walked past him, her steps slow and heavy. She didn't look back as she made her way down the street, disappearing around the corner with her few remaining possessions. Once she was gone, Benson stepped inside the now empty house. The air was thick with dust and the scent of age. He glanced around with disinterest, already making mental notes of what needed to be done to prepare the place for sale. It was just another property to him, nothing more. As he turned to leave, something made him pause. A slight flicker of discomfort, perhaps, or the faintest whisper of guilt. But he brushed it off as quickly as it had come, closing the door firmly behind him without a second thought. Months passed, and the cottage sat silent, untouched by any sign of life. Winter arrived with brutal force, covering the once cozy home with a thick blanket of snow. The small house, now stripped of its warmth and memories, seemed like a forgotten relic buried in the cold. Icicles hung from the roof, and the windows were coated with frost, their patterns intricate but indifferent. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, slipping through the empty rooms like an invisible visitor. Benson, however, had no thought to spare for the house. His mind was elsewhere, focused on his other business ventures, deals, and properties that promised quick profits. In his world, everything had a price, and everything could be replaced. The cottage, though vacant, was just one more asset in his growing portfolio, and its neglect did not bother him. He had evicted the widow without a second glance, confident that he would renovate and sell the house when the time was right. But as the long winter dragged on, something about the house began to gnaw at him, even if only in the back of his mind. He hadn't been back since that day he had forced Mrs. O'Leary out, and in the quiet moments of his busy life, he occasionally thought of her. He never admitted it, but a small part of him felt an unease about the way things had played out. He could still remember the way she had looked at the house before walking away, as if leaving behind a part of herself. But Benson, being the man he was, dismissed the thought as soon as it surfaced. After all, what was done, and sentimentality had no place in his life. As the snow began to melt, revealing patches of frozen ground, Benson decided it was finally time to return to the property. He had plans for the cottage now, a vision of it fully renovated and ready for market. He could see it in his mind: new paint, polished floors, and maybe even a few modern upgrades. He would easily turn a profit, and that was all that mattered. With a harsh winter behind him, the opportunity to cash in was ripe, and Benson wasn't one to miss an opportunity. The day he arrived at the house, the chill in the air still lingered. The cottage looked even more dilapidated than he remembered. The snow had left behind water stains on the walls, and the yard, once quaint and green, was now a patch of mud and dead grass. Benson stood outside, rubbing his gloved hands together as a bitter wind swept through the barren trees. The sight of the house made him frown. It looked tired, abandoned, but he quickly shook off any feelings of doubt. All it needed was a bit of work. As he walked up the path, his boots crunching over the icy gravel, he couldn't help but notice the strange quiet that surrounded the property. Even though it was daytime, the stillness was almost oppressive. The neighborhood had always been peaceful, but now it felt like the house was isolated from the rest of the world, its loneliness almost palpable. Benson ignored it, chalking up the eerie atmosphere to the fact that it had been empty for so long. He unlocked the door, the key sticking slightly in the old lock. The house creaked as he stepped inside, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the hollow rooms. The air inside was thick with dust, and the furniture Mrs. O'Leary had left behind was covered in a fine gray layer. The smell of dampness and neglect hung in the air. Benson wrinkled his nose in distaste, already mentally calculating how much it would cost to fix everything. He walked through the rooms with a detached eye, noting the peeling wallpaper and cracked floorboards. It was nothing a team of contractors couldn't handle, he thought. He would have the place cleaned out and renovated in no time, ready to put on the market by the spring. Yet as Benson moved through the house, a strange feeling crept over him, one that was hard to shake. The house didn't just feel empty, it felt like it was holding on to something he couldn't quite put into words. It was as if the walls themselves were still clinging to memories of the past, to the life that had once been here. Shaking his head, Benson stepped outside into the backyard, eager to escape the strange weight that had settled in his chest. He looked over the property with a critical eye, his thoughts already shifting back to the renovations. But as the wind picked up, sending a shiver down his spine, he couldn't help but feel that the house wasn't as forgotten as he had convinced himself. Benson stepped carefully through the house, his footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that coated the floors. The cold, stale air pressed down on him, and despite the daylight filtering weakly through the frost-covered windows, The place felt dark. As he walked through the rooms, the remnants of Mrs. O'Leary's life were still scattered about. Old furniture, faded curtains, and personal belongings left behind in the rush to evict her. It was clear she hadn't had the time to properly gather everything. His eyes landed on a small, dusty bookshelf by the window. The books, their spines cracked and worn, had likely been untouched for years, and a sense of unease flickered in his mind. Benson felt a twinge of something unfamiliar. Guilt, perhaps? He quickly pushed it aside, not wanting to dwell on it. After all, this was just another property to be dealt with, another business transaction to conclude. He moved into the living room, where a framed photograph still hung crookedly on the wall. Mrs. O'Leary's late husband, smiling proudly in his military uniform, stared back at him. Benson frowned, his gaze lingering on the picture for a moment longer than he intended. His mind briefly wandered to the day of the eviction, to the way Mrs. O'Leary had clutched that same photograph in her hands, tears in her eyes, begging for more time. He shook his head, irritated with himself. He had done what he had to do. She couldn't pay the rent. It was as simple as that. Business was business, and emotions had no place in it. Pushing his thoughts aside, Benson walked through the rest of the house, mentally making a list of repairs that would need to be addressed before he could sell it. The wallpaper in the hallway was peeling badly, and the wooden floor creaked with every step. He jotted down a few notes on his phone, his focus narrowing in on the practical details. But as he moved toward the back of the house, the atmosphere began to shift. There was something unsettling about the air back here, something heavy and thick. The temperature seemed to drop even more, though he couldn't explain why. Benson, always the rational man, dismissed the feeling as nothing more than the house's age and disrepair. But when he stepped out the back door and into the yard, the sensation deepened. The backyard, once a neat, modest space, was now overgrown and wild, as if nature had taken over in the months since Mrs. O'Leary had left. A large oak tree stood in the center of the yard, its branches bare and twisted, swaying slightly in the wind. Benson frowned as he walked toward it. The tree looked ancient, its roots gnarled and spreading beneath the frozen earth. But what caught his attention was the ground near its base. The soil there seemed disturbed, uneven. It looked as though something or someone had recently dug there. Curiosity flared in Benson, momentarily overpowering his discomfort. His logical mind, always seeking explanations, tried to make sense of it. Had Mrs. O'Leary buried something here before she left? Or had it been disturbed by an animal, perhaps? But the more he stared at the patch of earth, the stranger it seemed. There was a deliberate shape to it, a small mound of dirt that didn't belong in the otherwise untouched yard. Against his better judgment, Benson found himself walking back into the house to find something to dig with. He returned with an old, rusted shovel he had found leaning in the corner of the garage. With each step back toward the tree, the wind seemed to pick up, the air around him growing colder and more tense. He ignored it, shaking off the growing unease. He knelt down at the base of the tree and began to dig. The first few scoops of dirt came easily, but the deeper he went, the more resistance he met. His heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of exertion and an inexplicable sense of anticipation. His rational mind insisted that he wouldn't find anything of importance, but something about this felt purposeful, almost fated. After what felt like an eternity, Benson's shovel hit something hard. He paused, breathing heavily, his hands trembling slightly from the cold and the effort. He knelt down, brushing the dirt away with his hands, revealing the outline of a small chest. It was old, its metal hinges rusted and worn from time. For a moment, Benson simply stared at it, his mind racing with questions. What was this? Why was it buried here? His heart raced as he reached for the chest's lid, not yet realizing that what lay inside would change everything. Benson stared at the small, rusted chest for what felt like a long moment, his breath visible in the cold air. The metal was corroded and dirt-streaked, a relic of the past that seemed out of place in the otherwise ordinary backyard. He ran his gloved fingers over the worn surface, wiping away some of the dirt to reveal the old, weathered wood beneath. His curiosity was piqued. This wasn't something he had expected to find. He had come here to plan renovations, to make a quick profit. Yet here he was, crouched before an old mysterious chest buried beneath a tree. With a mix of hesitation and excitement, Benson pried at the lid. The hinges creaked in protest, the rust making it difficult to open. For a moment, he thought it might be too far gone to budge. But after a few more tries, the chest finally gave way. The lid lifted slowly, revealing the contents inside. What he saw wasn't at all what he expected. There were no jewels, no coins, no valuable heirlooms tucked away inside. Instead, the chest was filled with old papers, neatly folded letters, and faded photographs. On top of the stack, a few military medals gleamed faintly in the pale afternoon light, their ribbons worn and frayed from age. Benson's brow furrowed as he stared at the items. He reached in, picking up one of the letters carefully, the brittle paper threatening to tear at the edges. He unfolded the letter slowly, his eyes scanning the faded ink. It was dated from the 1940s, written in a tidy, looping script. Benson's heart raced slightly as he read the words, realizing that these weren't just any old letters. They were personal, intimate, correspondence between soldiers during World War II. The letter he held was addressed to Mrs. O'Leary, written by her late husband, Daniel. Benson sat back on his heels, the weight of the discovery sinking in. This wasn't just a forgotten chest of old memories. This was Mrs. O'Leary's history, her connection to a time long gone. His eyes flickered over the photographs, sepia-toned images of soldiers in uniform, standing together in foreign lands, smiling despite the harsh conditions that were surely around them. One photograph in particular caught his attention. In it, Daniel O'Leary stood proudly next to another man, both dressed in military garb. Something about the other man's face seemed oddly familiar. Benson's heart skipped a beat as he stared at the picture, recognition dawning slowly. The other man in the photo, standing shoulder to shoulder with Mrs. O'Leary's husband, was his own father. A chill ran down his spine as the realization took hold. He shuffled through the letters more urgently now, reading fragments of conversations between the two men, words exchanged during a time of unimaginable hardship. They had fought together, shared their hopes and fears, written home to their loved ones. The letters told the story of their bond, one forged in the fires of war, a friendship that ran deeper than Benson could have ever imagined. And yet his father had never spoken of Daniel O'Leary, never mentioned the connection, the shared past. Benson's mind raced, struggling to reconcile the image of his father, a stern, distant man with the heartfelt words written in these letters. How could he not have known? The wind picked up, rustling the branches of the oak tree above him, but Benson barely noticed. His focus was entirely on the contents of the chest, on the story they told, a story of loyalty, sacrifice, and unbreakable promises. He pulled out more letters, reading through them quickly, his breath catching as he found one addressed specifically to his father. It was from Daniel O'Leary, dated near the end of the war. The handwriting was shaky, as if written in haste. Benson read it carefully, the words striking him with a force he hadn't expected. "Robert, if anything happens to me, I need you to promise me one thing. Take care of my wife. She has no one else. I know you'll be there for her, like you've always been for me." The words echoed in Benson's mind, the weight of them sinking into his chest. His father had promised to protect Mrs. O'Leary, to look after her in her husband's absence. Yet here Benson was, having evicted her from her home without a second thought. He had thrown out the widow of a man his father had sworn to care for, without even knowing the depth of their connection. For the first time in years, Benson felt something stir in him that wasn't driven by profit or ambition. It was guilt, raw and undeniable. He stared at the letters, the photographs, and the medals in the chest, realizing the enormity of his mistake. The house, the eviction, none of it was just business anymore. It was personal. Benson sat on the cold, hard ground, staring at the letters in his hands. His mind was racing, unable to process the weight of what he had just uncovered. The wind continued to whip around him, sending dried leaves skittering across the yard, but he barely noticed. All he could think about were the letters written decades ago between his father and Mrs. O'Leary's husband, Daniel. The words on the pages blurred as his thoughts tangled in confusion and guilt. How had he not known? How could his father, a man he thought he understood, never mention this deep connection with the O'Leary family? He looked again at the photograph of his father and Daniel, standing side by side in their uniforms. They looked young, full of life and hope, as if nothing could break the bond between them. And yet here Benson was, having completely severed that bond without even realizing it. He carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the chest, his hands trembling slightly as he did so. The guilt that had begun to gnaw at him when he evicted Mrs. O'Leary had now bloomed into something much heavier, much more suffocating. He had thrown out the widow of a man who had fought alongside his father, a man who had trusted Benson's father enough to ask him to protect his wife if he didn't make it back, and Benson had failed them both in the worst possible way. He stood up slowly, brushing the dirt from his knees, his mind spinning as he tried to think of what to do next. The house felt different now, less like an empty building and more like a monument to broken promises. Benson could still hear Mrs. O'Leary's voice in his head, the way she had begged for more time, clutching that photograph of her husband as if it were the last piece of him she had. He hadn't cared then, but now the memory of her standing in that doorway made his stomach twist. He couldn't stay here any longer, not without being crushed by the weight of what he had discovered. Grabbing the chest, Benson walked back through the house, his steps slower, heavier than when he had first arrived. The air inside felt thick, oppressive, and for the first time, he noticed how the house still seemed to carry the traces of the life that had been lived here. It wasn't just another property to be flipped. It was a home, one filled with decades of memories, love, and loss, and he had torn it all apart for the sake of profit. As Benson reached the front door, he paused, looking back at the house one last time. The peeling wallpaper, the creaky floorboards, the faded photographs still hanging on the walls, they all seemed to stare back at him, reminding him of what he had done. For a brief moment, he considered leaving everything as it was, walking away from the house and never looking back. But that wasn't an option anymore, not after what he had learned. With the chest tucked under his arm, Benson stepped outside into the chilly afternoon air. The wind had picked up, swirling around him as he locked the door behind him. He stood on the front steps for a long moment, staring at the house in silence. It no longer represented the promise of a tidy profit. It now felt like a debt he owed, one he wasn't sure he could ever repay. Benson climbed into his car, resting the chest on the passenger seat. As he drove away from the cottage, his mind raced with thoughts of how to make things right. He had to find Mrs. O'Leary. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could at least try to make amends. Maybe there was still a way to undo the damage he had caused, to restore some of the dignity he had stripped away from her. But it wouldn't be easy. Mrs. O'Leary had disappeared after the eviction, and he had no idea where to start looking for her. The memory of her walking down the street, her shoulders hunched under the weight of her sorrow, flashed through his mind. He had barely given her a second glance then, too consumed with his own plans. Now, finding her felt like the only thing that mattered. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the road ahead, Benson gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw clenched in determination. He had made a terrible mistake, one that would haunt him for the rest of his life if he didn't make it right. His father's letters had shown him a side of his family he had never known, a side that valued loyalty and friendship above all else. And now it was his responsibility to honor that legacy, no matter how difficult it would be. His next step was clear: find Mrs. O'Leary, no matter what it took. Benson sat behind the wheel, the road stretching out in front of him as the sun dipped lower on the horizon. His mind was still reeling from the letters, the photographs, the revelation that had struck him like a bolt of lightning. His father, a man who had rarely spoken about his past, had shared a bond with Daniel O'Leary, a bond so deep that it had led to a promise Benson had unknowingly shattered. The guilt gnawed at him, twisting his insides. He had evicted the widow of a man his father had vowed to protect, and the weight of that knowledge was almost unbearable. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, jaw clenched as he tried to focus. He needed to find Mrs. O'Leary. There was no question about that. But where to start? She had vanished after the eviction, leaving no trace of where she had gone. Benson had been so wrapped up in his own life at the time that he hadn't cared enough to ask anyone about her or her situation. Now, that lack of empathy had come back to haunt him. His phone sat on the passenger seat next to the small chest he had unearthed. The letters and photographs inside were the only clues he had, a connection to a past he had barely understood until now. He picked up the phone and scrolled through his contacts, trying to think of someone who might know where Mrs. O'Leary had gone. The local real estate agents? Maybe the neighbors. He hadn't bothered to get to know any of them either, but surely someone had seen her leave. After a few fruitless calls, Benson's frustration began to build. He was getting nowhere. The people he contacted either didn't know Mrs. O'Leary or hadn't seen her in months. One neighbor vaguely remembered her leaving with a small suitcase, but they didn't know where she had gone. Benson sighed, rubbing a hand across his tired face. The search was proving to be more difficult than he had anticipated, and the weight of his guilt seemed to grow with every dead end. As the evening sky darkened, Benson realized he couldn't just rely on the phone. He needed to go out and look for her in person. His first stop would be the local retirement communities. Perhaps she had found shelter there. He had a sinking feeling in his stomach as he thought about what her life must be like now, reduced to living in a small, unfamiliar space after losing the home she had shared with her husband for so many years. And it was all because of him. The drive felt long and lonely. Benson's thoughts kept circling back to the letters, to the promise his father had made, and to his own failure. He had always prided himself on being a shrewd businessman, but now that cold detachment felt like a flaw, not a strength. The image of Mrs. O'Leary standing in the doorway, her eyes filled with sorrow, kept flashing in his mind, making it harder to breathe with each passing mile. When he finally arrived at the first retirement community on his list, it was already dark. The building loomed quietly in front of him, its windows glowing faintly with the warm light of the residents inside. Benson hesitated for a moment, feeling a strange sense of unease. He wasn't used to this, showing up somewhere not for business, but to right a wrong. The weight of his guilt pressed harder against him as he stepped out of the car and approached the front door. Inside, the receptionist looked up from her desk, offering a polite but curious smile. "Can I help you, sir?" Benson cleared his throat, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. "I'm looking for someone, an elderly woman, Mrs. O'Leary. I'm not sure if she's living here, but I've been trying to track her down." The receptionist's smile faded slightly, and she tilted her head as if trying to recall a name from the dozens she must handle each day. "Mrs. O'Leary, I'm sorry, but I don't think we have anyone by that name here, but I can check the records for you." Benson nodded, his chest tightening as he waited. His pulse thrummed in his ears, each second feeling like an eternity. The receptionist tapped at her keyboard for a moment before looking back up at him, shaking her head apologetically. "No, sir. I'm afraid we don't have anyone with that name." He thanked her, feeling the weight of failure settling deeper. This was just the first stop, and he knew he couldn't give up yet. There were other places to check, other avenues to explore. But as he walked back to his car, a gnawing fear began to creep into his mind. What if he never found her? What if she had disappeared for good beyond his reach? The thought was unbearable, and for the first time in his life, Benson realized that fixing this mistake wasn't about him. It wasn't about easing his conscience or wiping the slate clean. It was about her, and he had to find her, no matter what it took. Benson sat in his car, the engine idling softly as he stared out at the darkened retirement community. The receptionist's words still echoed in his mind. "I'm afraid we don't have anyone with that name." He hadn't expected finding Mrs. O'Leary to be easy, but the reality of the search was starting to wear on him. He had driven from one retirement community to the next, called people he thought might know her whereabouts, but each lead had turned up cold. And with every failure, his guilt weighed heavier, sinking into his bones like the chill of the evening air. He checked the list he had made on his phone, tapping the screen to scroll down. There were still a few more places to check. He couldn't give up now. The urgency to find her was no longer just about redemption. It was about the realization that she deserved so much more than what he had done to her. He had taken away her home, a place that had meant everything to her, without a second thought. Now, with the letters and the memory of his father's promise still fresh in his mind, he knew he had to make things right. Benson started the car, pulling away from the curb and heading toward the next retirement community on his list. The streets were quiet, the glow of streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement from a recent rain. His thoughts churned as he drove, replaying the events of the past months. How had he become so cold, so disconnected? His entire life had been about money, success, and power. But now, all those things felt hollow. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about the kind of man he had become. And as much as he wanted to find Mrs. O'Leary to ease his conscience, he knew this went deeper than that. After what felt like hours of driving, he finally arrived at another community. This one was smaller, more modest, tucked away in a quiet corner of town. Benson parked and made his way inside, trying to ignore the nervous flutter in his chest. He approached the front desk, where another receptionist greeted him with a polite smile. "Good evening, sir. How can I help you?" she asked, her voice calm and kind. "I'm looking for someone," Benson said, his voice steady but laced with tension. "Her name is Mrs. O'Leary. She's an older woman, probably moved in recently." The receptionist's eyes narrowed thoughtfully as she tapped at her computer. "Let me check for you." Benson waited, the silence stretching uncomfortably long. His heart thudded in his chest, each beat echoing with the fear that this would be another dead end. The receptionist looked up after a few moments, her expression softening as she nodded. "Yes, we do have a Mrs. O'Leary here. She moved in a few months ago. Would you like me to call her down?" Benson let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Relief washed over him, but it was quickly followed by a surge of anxiety. He hadn't planned what he would say, how he would explain himself. How could he even begin to apologize for what he had done? "Yes, please," he said, his voice quieter now. "If she's available, I'd like to speak with her." The receptionist nodded and made the call, her voice soft as she relayed the message. Benson shifted nervously, his hands fidgeting in his coat pockets as he waited. The lobby was quiet, save for the hum of the heater and the soft clinking of dishes from the nearby dining hall. Time seemed to stretch on forever as he stared at the door, waiting for Mrs. O'Leary to appear. Finally, the sound of slow, shuffling footsteps echoed down the hallway. Benson turned, his heart pounding as he caught sight of her. Mrs. O'Leary looked much the same as she had the day he evicted her, though perhaps a bit more frail. Her eyes, however, held a calmness he hadn't seen before. There was no trace of the sorrow or desperation that had marked her face the last time they had met. She carried herself with quiet dignity, despite the weight of her years. She stopped a few feet away from him, her gaze steady but curious. "Mr. Benson?" she asked softly, her voice as gentle as ever. Benson swallowed, feeling the lump in his throat as he struggled to find the right words. "Mrs. O'Leary, I've been looking for you," he began awkwardly, his voice tight with emotion. "I need to apologize for everything." Her expression didn't change, but there was a softness in her eyes that made his heart ache even more. She said nothing, allowing him the space to continue. "I didn't know," Benson said, his voice trembling slightly. "I didn't know about my father, about the promise he made to your husband. I didn't know how much this house how much your home meant to you. I'm sorry for what I did to you. I was wrong." Mrs. O'Leary remained silent, her face unreadable as she listened. But Benson could see a flicker of something in her eyes, something that told him she understood the weight of his words. "I want to make it right," he added, his voice breaking slightly. "If you'll let me." Mrs. O'Leary stood quietly for a moment, her eyes locked on Benson's face. There was no anger in her expression, no bitterness. If anything, she seemed calm, as if the storm that had once shaken her world had passed long ago. Her hands, still slightly trembling from age, rested gently in front of her. Benson couldn't help but notice how small and fragile she looked, and yet the strength in her silence was undeniable. "I see," she finally said, her voice soft but steady. "You've come all this way to apologize." Benson nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He had rehearsed this moment in his head, imagined a dozen ways the conversation could go, but nothing had prepared him for the actual encounter. Standing in front of her now, face to face with the woman he had wronged so deeply, he felt the full weight of his actions pressing down on him. "I was wrong, Mrs. O'Leary," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "I shouldn't have evicted you. I didn't know about your husband, about my father's promise. But that's no excuse. I want to make it right." Mrs. O'Leary's lips curved into a small, bittersweet smile, one that spoke of a deep understanding. "You can't turn back time, Mr. Benson. What's done is done." Her words were gentle, but they stung all the same. Benson felt his chest tighten. He had come here to make amends, to offer her the house back, to fix the mess he had created. But now he wasn't sure if that was even possible. "I want to give you the house back," he said quickly, his words tumbling out in his rush to make her understand. "It's yours. I should never have taken it from you in the first place. And I want to do more. Anything I can to make this right." For a moment, Mrs. O'Leary said nothing. She just stood there, studying him, her eyes filled with a quiet wisdom that made Benson feel like a small, foolish child. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she shook her head slowly. "No, Mr. Benson," she said, her voice still calm. "I don't need the house anymore." Benson blinked in surprise, the weight of her words sinking in. "But it's your home?" he stammered, unable to comprehend her refusal. "You lived there for so many years. I thought—" "I know what you thought," Mrs. O'Leary interrupted gently. "But after I lost the house, I learned something important. For a long time, I was tied to that place because of the memories. I thought it was the only way I could hold on to my husband, to the life we shared there. But I was wrong. Losing the house forced me to let go of the past, to finally move forward. I've found peace, Mr. Benson. More peace than I've had in years." Her words hung in the air between them, and Benson felt his heart drop. This wasn't the response he had expected. He had imagined she would be angry, hurt, maybe even grateful for the chance to reclaim her home. But here she was, telling him that she didn't want it back, that she had moved on without it. "I don't understand," he said, his voice quieter now. How can you be at peace after everything I did?" Mrs. O'Leary smiled again, but this time it was a smile full of warmth. "Forgiveness, Mr. Benson," she said softly. "I've had to forgive a lot of things in my life. But forgiving you, that was easier than I expected, because I realized that holding on to that anger, that pain, it wasn't doing me any good. It was only keeping me trapped in the past, and I didn't want to be trapped anymore." Benson stood there, speechless. Forgiveness. It was a concept he had never given much thought to before. In his world, everything was transactional, driven by profit and loss. But Mrs. O'Leary's words were showing him a different path, one he hadn't considered. "You've come to apologize, and I accept your apology," Mrs. O'Leary continued, her eyes kind but firm. "But you can't undo what's been done. What you can do, though, is decide how you move forward." Benson swallowed hard, the reality of her words sinking in. He had expected that giving her the house back would be enough, that it would somehow erase the guilt he felt. But Mrs. O'Leary was showing him that redemption didn't come from material things. It came from something deeper. "What can I do?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "How can I make things right if you don't want the house?" Mrs. O'Leary looked at him thoughtfully, as if weighing her words carefully. "You can use that house to help others, Mr. Benson," she said quietly. "Turn it into something good. Let it become a place where people who need it most can find refuge. That would honor my husband's memory more than anything else." Benson stared at her, the magnitude of her suggestion hitting him like a wave. He had never considered something like that before. But as he stood there, looking into Mrs. O'Leary's kind, forgiving eyes, he realized that this was his chance to finally do something meaningful, something beyond just making money. And maybe, just maybe, it was the first step toward becoming the man he should have been all along. Benson stood frozen, Mrs. O'Leary's suggestion still ringing in his ears. Turn the house into something that would help others. The simplicity and power of the idea left him speechless. He had spent so much time wrapped up in his own greed and ambition that he had never once considered the house as anything more than a piece of property, something to buy and sell. And yet, here was Mrs. O'Leary, offering him a way to make amends that went far beyond his initial plan of simply returning the house. "You mean a community center?" he asked, his voice tentative, as if he was still trying to process the idea. Mrs. O'Leary nodded gently. "Yes, something like that. A place where people can come together, where those in need can find support. Maybe even a place for veterans, like my Daniel, or for the elderly who have no family left. It would mean a lot to me, and to him." Benson swallowed hard. The image of the house, bustling with life and purpose, began to form in his mind. Instead of sitting empty and cold, it could become a place of warmth and connection, a place where people who had nowhere else to go could find a sense of belonging. The idea was so different from anything he had ever done before, but it stirred something deep inside him. It felt right. "I don't know why I never thought of that," Benson admitted, his voice low with regret. "I've been so focused on making money, on flipping properties for a profit, that I've never stopped to think about what good could come from them. I've been blind." Mrs. O'Leary smiled kindly, her eyes soft with understanding. "We all lose our way sometimes. What matters is that you're finding it now." Benson felt a lump form in his throat, the weight of her forgiveness almost too much to bear. For years, he had built his life around success and wealth, believing that those things defined his worth. But now, standing before Mrs. O'Leary, he realized how empty it all was. The house, the money, the business. It meant nothing if it didn't make a difference in the lives of others. "I want to do this," Benson said, more determined now. "I want to turn the house into something meaningful, something that will honor your husband and give back to the community." Mrs. O'Leary's eyes sparkled with a quiet joy. "I think that would be the best way to honor Daniel. He would have wanted that. He always believed in helping others, in doing what was right, no matter the cost." Benson nodded, feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about the profit margin or the market value. He was thinking about the people who would benefit from this new project, the lives that could be touched by turning the house into a community center. It was a chance to finally do something good, something that mattered. "There's so much I need to do," he said, more to himself than to Mrs. O'Leary. "I'll need to hire contractors, get permits, but I want to make sure it's perfect. A place that feels welcoming, that people can call home." Mrs. O'Leary nodded in approval. "I'm sure you'll do a wonderful job, and I'll be here to help if you need anything. After all, it was my home for so long. I know what it can be." Benson's heart swelled with gratitude. The idea of working with Mrs. O'Leary to turn the house into a place of refuge and connection felt like the redemption he had been searching for. It was more than just making up for his mistakes. It was a chance to build something lasting, something that could give people hope. "I don't know how to thank you," Benson said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "For your forgiveness, for giving me a way to make this right." Mrs. O'Leary smiled warmly, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "You're already doing it, Mr. Benson. You're choosing a different path. That's enough." Benson looked at her, humbled by her grace. He had come here seeking forgiveness, and now he was leaving with a new purpose. The house, which had once been a symbol of his greed, would now become a place of healing and support. And in some way, that would help him heal too. As they said their goodbyes, Benson felt a renewed sense of determination. He had a long road ahead of him, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't walking it alone. He had Mrs. O'Leary's blessing in the memory of her husband to guide him. And more than anything, he had a new understanding of what it meant to truly make amends. Months passed and the transformation of the house was finally complete. What had once been an empty, forgotten building was now a thriving community center. The walls had been repainted, the floors polished, and the yard cleared and revitalized. Benson had poured his energy into every detail, ensuring that the space felt warm and welcoming to all who entered. A plaque was mounted by the front entrance, engraved with the words, "The Daniel O'Leary Community Center, a place of peace and support." On the day of the center's grand opening, the house buzzed with activity. Veterans, families, and elderly community members filled the space, their laughter and conversations filling the rooms that had once been silent. Children played in the yard, while volunteers organized donations of food and clothing in the living room. The house, which had once been a symbol of Benson's cold, transactional nature, was now alive with purpose. Mrs. O'Leary arrived quietly, as she often did. She moved through the space with a calm dignity, smiling softly as she watched the people who now benefited from the place that had once been her home. Benson approached her, a mixture of pride and humility in his heart. "It's incredible to see this place like this," Benson said, his voice low but filled with emotion. "I never imagined it could become something so meaningful." Mrs. O'Leary smiled warmly, nodding in agreement. "It's exactly what Daniel would have wanted, a place where people feel safe, where they can come together and find help when they need it most." Benson nodded, feeling the truth of her words. This was more than just a building. It was a living testament to Daniel's legacy and to the power of forgiveness. For Benson, it was a second chance, a way to atone for the mistakes he had made, and an opportunity to finally do something that mattered. As the day continued, Benson watched the center in action. People gathered in the common areas, veterans shared stories, and elderly residents found companionship they hadn't had in years. It was everything Mrs. O'Leary had envisioned, and Benson couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. Before she left, Mrs. O'Leary turned to Benson one last time. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not just for the center, but for finding your way back to what's important." Benson smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in a long time. "Thank you, Mrs. O'Leary, for showing me the way." As she walked away, Benson knew that the house had finally become something far greater than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just a place to live, it was a home for the heart, and for the first time, Benson felt truly at peace. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Now, how about another one? To watch another nice story, just click on the video appearing on your screen.